Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling some really interesting sources that you all sent in about immigration. Really about the history of how different groups have been perceived and treated, upon arriving here in America. And, I was thinking about this, at some point, all of our ancestors were the other.
That's such a crucial point to start with, This whole idea that the story of America is a story of immigration, but it's also a story of this tension between welcoming newcomers and at the same time fearing their impact.
Right, yeah, and that tension is still so relevant today. I mean, it's not just some abstract historical thing. It affects how we see the world today.
Absolutely.
How we define what it means to be American. So let's dive right in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Way back to the 17 and 1800s. Okay. We're talking about groups like Germans, Scots, Irish Catholics coming to America.
It's funny to think about, Benjamin Franklin. One of our founding fathers was actually worried about Pennsylvania becoming Germanized because of all the German settlers.
Wow.
Which is kind of ironic considering how much of what we think of as American culture today has those German roots.
That is pretty wild, yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like this fear of immigrants changing the existing social fabric was there from the very beginning.
But it wasn't just about culture, was it?
No, absolutely not. Religion played a huge role, too.
Yeah.
Catholics, for example, were often seen with a lot of suspicion by the Protestant majority.
Yeah.
They were accused of, being more loyal to the Pope than to America.
It's interesting how these religious tensions were often tied up with economic and cultural anxieties as well, like blaming a specific group for taking jobs or changing the American way of life. And speaking of anxieties, things get even more intense as we move into the mid-1800s with the Irish potato famine. Huge numbers of Irish Catholics came to America during that time. And the way they were portrayed in the media is really shocking. I mean, political cartoons from that era depicted the Irish as ape-like creatures, a danger to American democracy.
Wow.
Can you imagine seeing those images circulated today?
I had no idea it was that blatant. It's a stark reminder of how quickly fear can morph into outright dehumanization. And sadly, the Irish weren't the only ones facing this kind of treatment. Around the same time, you have the Chinese arriving, drawn by the gold rush, right?
Exactly, but they encountered intense discrimination fueled by this idea that they were stealing jobs from white laborers. And this fear ultimately led to the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which specifically banned Chinese laborers from immigrating.
That act was a turning point. It was one of the first times the U.S. government explicitly excluded an entire group of people based on their race and nationality. It's chilling to think about the ripple effects of that decision.
And those ripple effects continue. Think about the Japanese experience in the early 20th century, for instance. They faced similar exclusionary laws and during World War II were unjustly incarcerated in internment camps simply because of their ancestry.
It's heartbreaking how easily fear and prejudice can override basic human rights. And all of this while the Mexican experience was unfolding, showcasing this cyclical pattern of America needing immigrant labor, but also fearing their presence. It's like a constant push and pull.
Exactly. In the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there were calls to deport Mexicans, even though they were vital to the agricultural sector. And then in the 1950s, we saw Operation Wetback, a mass deportation program targeting Mexican laborers.
Right.
Again, driven by anxieties about illegal immigration and competition for jobs.
So from the very beginning, we see this pattern of specific groups being labeled as the other and blamed for societal problems. But why? Why does this keep happening?
Well, if you look closely, there's some common threads running through these seemingly disparate events. It often boils down to a mix of economic anxieties, cultural prejudice, and political opportunism.
It's like someone is always ready to exploit those fears for their own gain.
It's a potent mix that unfortunately continues to influence our immigration policies and how we talk about immigration today.
Okay, so we've seen how this played out with the Irish, the Chinese, the Japanese, and Mexicans. But how does this pattern continue as we move into the mid-20th century?
That's where things get even more complex, but those same underlying anxieties are still driving the narrative.
All right, let's unpack that in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, so the mid-20th century saw a surge in migration from Puerto Rico after World War II. Many Puerto Ricans came to the mainland U.S., seeking better opportunities.
You'd think with the U.S. needing to rebuild after the war, they would have been welcomed with open arms.
Right.
But that wasn't always the case, was it?
Unfortunately not. They often faced discrimination, echoing the prejudices experienced by earlier Catholic immigrant groups. And this time, the anxieties weren't just about religious differences, but also about cultural and linguistic changes.
It's interesting how certain fears seem to get recycled and repackaged for each new wave of immigrants. And during this time, you also have the Cold War, adding another layer of complexity to the whole us versus them mentality.
Absolutely. With the rise of McCarthyism, Eastern European refugees fleeing communist regimes, they often found themselves caught in this web of suspicion. The fear of communism was so pervasive that anyone with even the slightest connection to Eastern Europe was viewed as a potential threat.
It's crazy to think how easily political anxieties can be used to fuel prejudice against entire groups of people. It seems like fear is a powerful tool for manipulating public opinion.
It certainly is, and sadly, that manipulation often has real-world consequences for the most vulnerable members of society.
And all this is happening while the Mexican experience continues to unfold. Didn't the Retiro program, which brought in Mexican laborers during World War II, ultimately backfire and intensify anxieties about illegal immigration?
That's right. The program ended in 1964, but the demand for Mexican labor didn't disappear. And this led to an increase in undocumented immigration, which in turn was used to justify harsher border control measures and fuel the narrative that Mexicans were a threat to American jobs and security.
It's like a vicious cycle, you know? One policy creates unintended consequences, which then get used to justify even more restrictive policies. It's a pattern that seems to keep repeating itself throughout history.
And that pattern becomes even more pronounced as we move into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. The post-9/11 era in particular brought a dramatic shift in how America viewed immigrants, especially those from Muslim-majority countries.
I remember that time so vividly. It felt like overnight, anyone who looked or sounded Middle Eastern was suddenly viewed as a potential terrorist.
Yeah.
It was incredibly unsettling.
Yeah, there was this surge in racial profiling, increased surveillance of Muslim communities, and policies that made it much harder for people from Muslim-majority countries to enter the U.S. It was a stark reminder of how quickly fear can erode civil liberties and create a climate of suspicion.
It's like we traded one enemy for another. First it was communists, then it became Muslims. It's heartbreaking how easily we seem to fall back on these us versus them narratives.
And it's not just Muslims who have been targeted. African immigrants who came to the U.S. during this time also faced discrimination, encountering both racial prejudices and the same tired stereotypes about being disease carriers or overly reliant on welfare.
It's like no matter who the new arrivals are, there's always this underlying fear that they're going to change America for the worse.
It's a deeply ingrained fear rooted in the idea that America has a specific identity that needs to be protected from outside influences. But what's often overlooked is that America's identity has always been fluid, constantly evolving, thanks to the contributions of immigrants from all over the world.
That's such an important point. Diversity isn't a threat to American identity. It's essential to it. And yet here we are in the 21st century, still wrestling with the same anxieties about immigration.
And those anxieties are playing out in a very real way right now with the ongoing situation regarding Central American migrants seeking asylum in the U.S.
It's like we're watching a replay of history, isn't it?
Exactly the same fears about economic displacement, cultural change, and criminality are being used to justify harsh policies and dehumanizing rhetoric. It's disheartening to see these patterns repeating themselves generation after generation.
Wow. It really is a lot to think about, isn't it?
It is.
Hearing how these patterns of fear and exclusion have played out over centuries of American history.
But it's also crucial to understand this history, to see the connections, between past and present.
Yeah.
Because only then can we start to maybe break these cycles.
So looking back at all these different groups who have been labeled as the other at some point,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways for you? What connects these seemingly disparate experiences?
Well, one thing that I find fascinating is that almost every immigrant group that we've talked about has faced similar accusations and anxieties, directed at them. They've been stereotyped as criminals, job stealers, a drain on resources, a threat to American culture and values.
It's like there's this playbook of prejudice that gets dusted off and reused with each new wave of immigrants.
Exactly, and what's even more striking is that these narratives often have very little basis in reality. They're driven by fear, not facts.
So if it's not about facts, what is it really about? What's the underlying motivation for creating these others?
I think it often comes down to power. The power to control resources, to define what it means to be American, to shape the narrative about who belongs and who doesn't.
It's like by creating this other, those in power can solidify their own position and deflect blame for societal problems.
Precisely, and that's why it's so important to be critical of these narratives, to question the motivations behind them, and to challenge the assumptions that they're based on.
It's a call to action, isn't it? To not just learn from the past, but to use that knowledge to create a more just and inclusive future.
Absolutely, because this isn't just about history. It's about who we are as a nation and who we want to be.
After hearing all of this, I have to ask, how does it change your perspective on current events? It's hard to listen to all of this and not see the echoes of the past in the headlines of today.
Yeah, it makes you realize that these debates about immigration aren't new. They're part of a much larger and longer story about how America grapples with its own identity as a nation built by immigrants.
Knowing that history, that context can hopefully help us make more informed decisions about how we approach immigration in the 21st century.
And it can also empower us to challenge the harmful rhetoric and policies that are often rooted in fear and prejudice.
Because ultimately, it's about recognizing our shared humanity, regardless of where we come from or how we got here.
And remembering that America's strength has always come from its diversity, from the contributions of people from all over the world.
Well said.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a heavy but very important conversation. Indeed, and to everyone listening out there, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on the history of the other in America. And more importantly, we hope that it inspires you to think critically about the narratives that we hear about immigration today, and to consider what role you can play in creating a more welcoming and inclusive society for all other social.